Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the announcement video for this year's Remembrance Reads. Um, First of all, let me talk about what is Remembrance Reads. I started doing Remembrance Reads about 4 years ago, um, and in November I devote the majority of the month's reading to books about World War One. That reading can be anything: poetry, fiction, short stories, memoirs, history, biography, autobiography, whatever, but as long as it's related to World War One. I began doing that because I decided to read In Parenthesis by David Jones one November, which is a book I'll talk a little bit more about later, as it still forms a sort of key part of Remembrance Reads for me anyway. And because I was reading that, I thought it would be fun to read some other books about World War One. I had amassed a sort of small collection over the years, and a lot of these remained unread, so hence Remembrance Reads. Why November? Well, in the UK, the 11th of November is Remembrance Day, um, chosen because World War One ended at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, or at least the main war did, between Germany and Austria-Hungary and France, Britain, etc. And it's traditional that at 11 a.m. on the 11th, there is a 2-minute silence in the UK. Although the official part of this process became in 1946 Remembrance Sunday, and so the nearest Sunday to the 11th of November there is a parade, an event held at the Cenotaph, at which the King, the Prime Minister, ex-Prime Ministers, Commonwealth ambassadors, and veterans or children of veterans will be. This includes the 2-minute silence. It's held at the Cenotaph, and this year it's on November the 9th. Now, when I was a child, obviously there were still World War One survivors at that parade, and lots of Second World War servicemen and women. Obviously, in 2025, there's no World War One veterans left, and there aren't a lot of World War Two ones. For example, I think the last surviving pilot from the Battle of Britain died this year. Um, so, and obviously this is a very British and English perspective, but we'll talk about it in more detail during the event itself. Now, also in November, the Royal British Legion sells poppies. You wear them in your lapel. If you're watching British television, you will see almost everybody presenting a news programme or a chat show or whatever is raring run. Um, uh, the money's used for charity to help veterans in need. It was the poppy was chosen because it was partly because it was the first flower to grow back on the battlefields after the war had come to an end, actually even during the war, and fundamentally because of a poem written by John McCrae. Now, John McCrae was a Canadian lieutenant colonel and a doctor. He died in 1918 of pneumonia, sadly. He wrote the poem in 1915, and it was published in December 1915. You probably know it. It goes, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that marks our place. And in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields, take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, to be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." So that was the badly read poem. I have to take a pause there because somebody came to the door. Yes, apologies for reading that so badly. If I could read poetry well, that would be a different thing. So that's some of the background. Now, why do I do Remembrance Reads? Well, World War One matters, not just because it's the first industrialised war, but because there was a world before it, certainly in Britain, and a world after it, and they are not the same. The British experience certainly was there had never been a war like it. Britain didn't have conscription, and because it's an island, our soldiers are part of a small professional army. Um, Indeed, for long periods of time, we've been hostile to the idea of standing armies at all. Um, but a lot of continental countries had military service, and all men served for a period. They were trained, but obviously the continent has borders where it's easy to cross. Armies march from one country to another, whereas Britain is an island, and for a long time our navy protected us from most threats. And occasionally we had to send an army to the continent, or chose to send an army to the continent, but mostly we never had to. So World War One is a jarring experience for Britain. It's an entirely new. It saw millions of British and Commonwealth subjects serving overseas for the first time ever, and the casualties were enormous. Every town, every village, every city, every family lost people, or had people wounded, both mentally and physically. The British and Commonwealth casualties from World War One are significantly higher than they were in World War Two, and even though that was a longer war, so that's one thing. But it's also a war about which we feel quite equivocal. It doesn't have the moral clarity of World War Two. It looks a lot of the time like pointless slaughter. It looks like a war which shouldn't have been fought, and it comes with its own mythology, to which literature contributes a huge amount. For example, there's the whole idea of lions led by donkeys, that British officers were unimaginably cold-hearted, stupid. Think of General Melchett from Blackadder as the classic example, sitting comfortably in a chateau while sending ordinary men out to be slaughtered without a care in the world. But that's one of the reasons I do remember its reads, because literature, this is probably the war where literature is the main way we perceive our views of an event, historical event. Certainly possibly more than World War II, where most of our perception, I'd argue, comes from films and television. So World War One matters because it's the last great literary war, and it matters because of what came afterwards. Artistic movements threw off the past, and they could use the argument that the boring liberal countries led us to war, that things needed shaking up, and certainly political movements as well came out and challenged all the old ways after World War One. Fascism, the Soviet Union. There were new nations. There were new arguments about nations, about borders, about which peoples belonged to which countries. World War One ended a lot of certainties, and I think that's these are all the reasons why I think Remembrance Reads is a thing I like to do. And also there was the literary responses to it were very broad. I mean, modernism is probably the most well-known one, but I think Tolkien was another, and somewhere in the middle of that, if you put modernism at one end and Tolkien at the other, you have David Jones's In Parenthesis. Now, what is in parenthesis, and why do I read it every Remembrance Read? In Parenthesis is a long prose poem, divided into 7 sections. So if you choose to, you can read one section a day. It follows Private John Ball from England to France, and thence to war, and thence to death. It's an unusual poem. It mixes modernism, military slang, older stories from myth and legend. There are the Song of Roland, the Bible, the Mabinogion, Egon Oddin, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and more. It's the kind of book I describe as a TARDIS book, because it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. It's one of my favourite works of literature. I personally think it's the best work of literature to come out of World War One. It is slightly underread because it is hard to take chunks out of it to put in poetry anthologies. So, unlike Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, etc., it doesn't crop up in poetry anthologies very often, and when it does, it's a chunk taken bleeding and thrown onto the page. I read it the first time that about 4 years ago when I first did my first Remembrance Read, but it's a core part of Remembrance from Reads for me every year. And this year, I'm hoping to make it even more so, because I'm hoping that I'm going to get an interview with someone that knows more about David Jones and In Parenthesis than I do, which is probably lots of people, because the one thing I should say, and this is, I am not an expert in any of these things. I am a enthusiastic amateur, a dilettante. I do have a history degree, but I graduated in 1992, and history is a dynamic discipline, and things change, and perceptions change, new works come out, so I can't pretend that I am an expert in this. But I love reading about World War One. I think it's a key turning point in the modern world. Basically, it's when the world becomes modern. So that's why. Now, you might be asking, how do I want to take part? Do I not want to take part? I'm not going to force people. You can't. Well, I can't force people to do it. even if I had that power. I don't want to be prescriptive about choices in what you read. So if you can take part in Remembrance Reads by reading any book about World War One. I'm not even going to say to you have to read In Parenthesis, because I'm aware that that's not the book most likely to encourage you to. Well, it's it's a difficult book, and I'm not going to pretend it's not. And I wouldn't, and it's one where I think it's good to have read some other stuff before you get to In Parenthesis. But you can read any book about World War One, and you've taken part in Remembrance Reads. If you want to do like a full set, then I would say read one book of poetry, one memoir stroke biography, one novel, and one history book. To give you a very bog standard selection, I'd go with a poetry anthology. Both Penguin and Oxford World Classics have a First World War poetry anthology. Go for a memoir, you could read Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, which is probably the best known of the soldier memoirs. For a novel, you could do All Quiet on the Western Front. And for history, Peter Hart's The Western Front. Now, that is all a very obvious selection, and there are lots to choose from. And my channel from last year has lots of recommendations if you want to dip into them. And you could read about lesser discussed fronts: the Eastern Front, the war in Africa, the naval war, the air war. You could read about the experiences of the Indian Army, of colonial forces, French and British colonial forces, of women, of the home front, of prisoners of war, of the injured, of conscientious objectors. There's a lot of books about World War One and about aspects of World War One. So you go out there and pick one general history maybe, and then look at what really catches your attention. So there you go. That's my In Parenthesis announcement. I'll make another video in late October about what I'll actually be reading alongside In Parenthesis. I hope some of you will join me. I won't judge you harshly if you don't. And that's it for this announcement. So have a good one, and I will speak to you all anon.